41%. That is the share of China's domestic artificial intelligence server shipments running homegrown silicon in 2025, and the 1.65 million chips behind that number were, 2 years earlier, a rounding error so small the instrument barely registered them. In 2023, that same gauge read near zero. Nvidia was not one option among many for Chinese artificial intelligence server builders. It was the category. This script measures the distance between those two readings, the mechanism that closed it, and the 3 reasons that distance may be smaller or larger than the instrument suggests. Near zero in 2023. 41% now. 1.65 million. Shipped. The 2 readings are separated by roughly 24 months and by a sequence of policy documents, export control filings, and procurement list revisions that together constitute the mechanism. Watch what each one did to the count. The baseline reading comes from 2023, when China's artificial intelligence server build-out was running almost entirely on imported silicon. The hardware of choice was Nvidia's highest-tier accelerators, the A100 class and the H100 class, which Chinese cloud operators, state enterprises, and research institutions had been purchasing freely for years. Those chips powered the training clusters and the inference deployments that made up the bulk of China's artificial intelligence compute capacity. Domestic alternatives existed on paper and in early commercial samples, but the shipment volumes were negligible. Cambricon, Biren, Mthreads, and the Huawei Ascend line were all operating at early commercial scale, constrained by yield issues, limited software ecosystems, and a buyer base that had little incentive to absorb the switching cost when imported silicon was accessible and performant. The domestic share of artificial intelligence server shipments in that environment was not a stable low number waiting to climb. It was effectively absent from the measurement. The now reading is 2025, and analyst estimates from firms including IDC and Analyst, as reported in trade press, place the domestic share of China's artificial intelligence server shipments at roughly 41%. The volume attached to that share is 1.65 million domestic artificial intelligence accelerator chips shipped. Those are analyst estimates, not audited shipment data, and that distinction matters. But the directional signal is consistent across multiple independent estimates. Alongside those shipment figures sits a government procurement document that names 9 distinct domestic artificial intelligence chip products as approved for government and government-adjacent purchasing, while Nvidia does not appear on that list. Stack those 1.65 million accelerator cards end to end, each card roughly the length of a forearm, and the line runs past 2,600 kilometers. That is the physical length of the domestic silicon that entered Chinese artificial intelligence servers in a single year, laid out flat. The delta between the 2 readings is roughly 41 percentage points in approximately 2 years. That rate of change is the first thing worth interrogating, because it does not match the pace of organic technology substitution. When engineers choose better tools through normal market processes, evaluating performance, switching costs, software compatibility, supply reliability, that kind of substitution runs on 5 to 10-year cycles. A move from near zero to 41% in 24 months is not the speed of engineers choosing, it is the speed of a market being steered. The mechanism is not superior silicon. The mechanism is who writes the approved vendor list and what names appear on it. The sequence that produced that steering began with United States export controls in October 2022, which restricted the export of Nvidia's highest-tier accelerators to China. That first round cut off the A100 and H100. Nvidia engineered replacement products, the A800 and H800, specifically tuned to fall below the control thresholds. A second round of tightening in October 2023 closed that workaround, blocking the replacement products as well. Each successive round narrowed the gap between what Nvidia could legally sell into China and what Chinese artificial intelligence training clusters actually required, until the gap became a wall. The wall did not arrive all at once, it was built in stages, each stage closing the previous round's engineered exception. Chinese government procurement rules then did something that export controls alone could not do. Export controls restricted supply. Procurement rules restructured demand. A government list that names 9 domestic artificial intelligence chip products as approved and omits Nvidia entirely does not merely permit domestic buying. It converts every government-funded purchase into a mandate. A buyer working under that list has no compliant path to imported silicon, regardless of price, regardless of performance, regardless of whether a domestic alternative meets the workload requirements. The permissible answer is already determined before the first vendor call. A government procurement list works the way a building code works. Engineers do not choose to pour reinforced concrete because they prefer it over other materials. They pour it because every structure that passes through permitting must meet the specification. Once the specification names domestic silicon, every purchase that touches public money is already decided. The 1.65 million units are not the result of a sales campaign. They are the result of a code update. That procurement cascade matters because central government lists in China do not stop at central government purchases. They set the template that state-owned enterprises, provincial governments, and publicly funded research institutions follow. A list change at the center propagates into thousands of purchasing decisions without requiring individual negotiation at each level. The domestic chip vendors named on that list did not need to win 9,000 separate competitive evaluations. They needed to be on the list once, and the list did the distribution. This is procurement as demand creation, not demand capture. Normal demand capture means a supplier wins business that already existed. What the government list did here was different. It created demand that was structurally absent by making domestic chips the only permissible answer to a government-funded question. The 1.65 million units shipped are not evidence of buyer preference. They are evidence of a mandate converting into volume. The third reading worth taking is the composition of the vendor ecosystem that had to absorb that mandate. In 2023, the domestic artificial intelligence chip market had one supplier operating at meaningful scale: the Huawei Ascend line, which had the manufacturing relationships, the software stack depth, and the supply chain maturity to fulfill large orders. The other domestic vendors were early stage. A procurement mandate that arrived in 2023 would have been difficult to fill from the domestic side because the supply base was too thin. The procurement list that exists in 2025 names 9 distinct domestic artificial intelligence chip products. That count, 9, is itself a measurement. It signals that the vendor ecosystem has broadened enough that a government list can name multiple suppliers rather than directing all volume to a single domestic source. The export control period triggered a state-backed investment surge across the domestic chip design ecosystem. Multiple fabless designers accelerated their development timelines, and SMIC's most advanced available manufacturing process, below the leading edge held by TSMC but sufficient for a range of inference workloads, became the default domestic manufacturing anchor for chips that needed to ship at volume. The ecosystem went from one viable supplier to a named field of at least 9 products in roughly the same 24-month window that produced the shipment delta. From one domestic supplier capable of volume in 2023 to 9 named products on the approved list in 2025. 9. The exclusion on that list is as load-bearing as the additions. A procurement document that names acceptable suppliers implicitly closes the purchase path to every name absent from it. Nvidia's absence is not a commercial setback in the ordinary sense of a supplier losing a competitive evaluation. It is a structural gate that routes every government-adjacent purchase away from imported silicon, regardless of price or performance or workload fit. Adding 9 domestic chips to the list matters. What matters as much is what the list does not contain. The exclusion is the instrument. The 9 additions are its readout. Nvidia's position in China's market followed the same sequence as the shipment delta, moving in the opposite direction. Before October 2022, Nvidia's accelerators were freely exportable to China, and China represented Nvidia's third-largest geographic revenue market. Nvidia's own regulatory filings note China revenue concentration as a risk factor. The specific revenue percentages shift quarter to quarter and are not cited here to avoid stating a stale figure, but the directional arc is documented. From a major revenue geography before the first export control round to a constricted one after successive tightening closed each engineered workaround. The product sequence tells the story. The A100 blocked, replaced by the A800. The H100 blocked, replaced by the H800. The A800 and H800 blocked. The gap between what Nvidia can legally sell into China and what Chinese artificial intelligence training clusters require has widened with each revision, and no currently compliant Nvidia product reaches the compute thresholds that government buyers are specifying for large-scale training infrastructure. The instrument reading stands at 41%. Before accepting that reading as precise, 3 sources of measurement error are worth stating plainly. The first is the gap between shipment and utilization. 1.65 million domestic artificial intelligence accelerators shipped is a shipment count, not a utilization count. Chips travel from fabrication to distribution to server chassis before they run a single inference job. A government mandate can accelerate procurement without accelerating deployment at the same rate. If a meaningful fraction of those 1.65 million chips are sitting in inventory, in distribution channels, or in server chassis that have not yet been put into production service, then the 41% share overstates domestic silicon's actual contribution to China's running artificial intelligence compute. Shipped volume and running compute are different instruments, and only one of them has a reading. The second source of error is the absence of independent audit. The procurement list is a policy document. There is no publicly available independent audit confirming that government-adjacent buyers are purchasing exclusively from the named 9 vendors. Informal workarounds are structurally possible in any constrained procurement environment. Gray market chips, purchases routed through non-government entities that then provide services to government customers on a contract basis, or older imported inventory that predates the current list restrictions. The delta measured here is the delta in official procurement rules, which is real and documented. The delta in actual silicon running government artificial intelligence workloads may differ from what the official rules specify, and no third-party source has yet measured that gap. The third source of error is the node gap and the workload ceiling it creates. Domestic artificial intelligence chips manufactured on SMIC's most advanced available process sit at a meaningful disadvantage relative to chips produced on TSMC's leading-edge nodes in raw transistor density and in energy efficiency per operation. For inference workloads, running a trained model against incoming requests, that gap is manageable. Inference is less compute-intensive per unit of useful output, and the domestic chips on the procurement list are generally understood to meet inference workload requirements at production scale. For large-scale training runs, building foundation models from scratch or fine-tuning them at the scale that produces competitive frontier performance, the gap in memory bandwidth, chip-to-chip interconnect speed, and sustained throughput under training conditions is substantial and is not closed by a procurement list update. A 41% share of server shipments does not imply 41% of China's artificial intelligence training compute. The two are different instruments, and the training instrument has a different reading from the shipment instrument. The synthesis across those 3 points is this: the directional move is real, and it is supported by multiple independent analyst estimates pointing the same way. Near 0 to roughly 41% in domestic server shipments is a verified directional change. What the current instrument cannot yet resolve is whether the chips that shipped are running the workloads that make them strategically significant, or whether the node gap caps their contribution to inference tier deployment, while the training tier remains structurally constrained by what domestic manufacturing processes can currently produce. A procurement mandate can fill a warehouse. It cannot close a fabrication process gap on the same timeline. The measure's plain reading of the 2-year arc is this: the delta is directional and structural, and it was not produced by domestic chips becoming better than Nvidia chips in 2 years. They did not. A 41 percentage point move in 24 months is the speed of a market being administratively redirected, not organically disrupted. The export controls drew a wall around imported silicon. The procurement list named the domestic alternatives. The cascade from central government list to state enterprise purchasing decision to research institution order did the distribution. Each of those steps converted policy into volume, and the volume is now 1.65 million chips in 1 year. This is what the instrument records across the 2 readings: a metric that sat at near 0 while Nvidia had market access, then accelerated at the moment that access was administratively closed, and domestic alternatives were mandated into the permissible purchase column. The restriction did not freeze the domestic share at 0. The restriction is precisely what moved it to 41%. The gauge moved 41 points in 2 years. The next question is not whether it moves again. It is whether the crossing of 50% arrives before or after domestic silicon can carry a large-scale training workload at competitive throughput, because those are 2 different thresholds, and right now only one of them has been crossed. Watch the next government procurement cycle expected within 12 months for 2 signals: whether the domestic share in server shipments crosses 50%, and whether the approved list expands beyond 9 chip products or begins to specify minimum compute performance tiers that would require vendors to close the node gap to remain listed. If the list adds a compute floor, it stops being a demand mandate and starts being a capability mandate, and that would be a different instrument reading an entirely different delta. If you track this metric, subscribe and turn on notifications. The next reading will tell us whether 41% was a plateau or a waypoint.